Have you ever felt lost and confused when reading 1st and 2nd Kings? These two books, which I'll refer to as the Book of Kings, are some of the toughest books to really stay focused and figure out what's going on in the entire Bible. We have a lot of people, a lot of names, a lot of dates, a lot of events, and it's just kind of like you're drinking from a fire hose. But within all of that information that these two books give us, we actually have a few very significant plot points that develop throughout the overarching story of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And as we know, if you've been following along with us at all this year through reading the Bible, these plot points that span from Genesis all the way to Revelation link this whole biblical narrative together. It's what we call the meta-narrative. So the 66 books of the Bible aren't just totally disconnected from one another. They're actually very much interconnected. And the events of one book set up and lead to the events of another book, and so on and so forth. So as we're reading through the books of Kings, we really want to ask, how did we get here? What major contributions are happening right now so that I can better understand God and his overarching plan of redemption and just become more in awe and wonder of him? And then how do the events of Kings set us up for where we're going next? So that's what we're going to tackle in this video. I'm going to share my screen in a moment and we're going to dive right in. So let's go. So the Book of Kings, which again I refer to 1st and 2nd Kings collectively as just the Book of Kings. The Book of Kings tells one overarching story, but it's made up of a bunch of different and smaller kind of sub-stories that all work together in order to propel that overarching story forward. And so when we zoom out and look at this book from 50,000 feet, we really see kind of 6 major events. And we want to kind of understand when and where these events happen, but also how all of the little sub-narratives weave together and kind of build and propel us towards these major events. So the 6 major events are, we have the transition of power from David to his son Solomon. We see that in 1 Kings chapters 1 through 2. Then the next significant event is the construction of the temple. So Solomon builds a grand temple, and that's in chapters 5 through 6, and then Solomon dedicates that temple to the Lord in chapter 8. The third major event is the splitting of the kingdom. So Solomon inherits a united kingdom, Solomon's son inherits a united kingdom, but then during his son's reign, that kingdom splits. And so that is a majorly significant point that happens in 1 Kings 12, that if you don't pick up on it, you are really confused for the rest of 1 Kings and 2 Kings. The fourth thing that we see really kind of going on from 1 Kings 13 through 2 Kings 13 is the ministry of the prophets. So once we get into this divided kingdom era, now all of a sudden we have these prophets or men of God that spring up in the narrative, and they are proclaiming things. They're proclaiming the message of Yahweh to the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So we can kind of get lost in that whole thing, because now not only do we have 2 kingdoms, but we also have prophets talking to both of them, right? The 5th major event, and this is kind of one of the 2 things that the entire book, both the overarching narrative and those sub-narratives, have been working towards, and that is the exile of Israel, the northern kingdom. They go into exile to the Assyrian Empire in the date of 722 BC. So that's that is a major event in the Book of Kings, and that occurs in 2 Kings 17. Then the 6th and final event, which is kind of part 2 of the major things that the book is working towards. So part 1 is the exile of Israel. Part 2, and our 6th and final plot point, is the exile of Judah to Babylon. And that takes place over a few years, but really it goes from about 605 BC down to 586 BC, where this kind of installments of exile. And so the southern kingdom of Judah also goes into exile. And so the book ends with all of God's people, the descendants of Abraham, in exile in two different empires. So the first one was the Assyrian Empire, then their empire falls, and then you have the Babylonian Empire. And so that's where the book ends, and it's kind of a wild roller coaster of a ride. So we're not going to get into all of the theological events that happen, but we're going to track this main overarching narrative through these two books and kind of help you get a little bit of a better grasp of what am I reading and where am I and how do I kind of stay focused and not get lost and confused. So everything works towards those 6 plot points. But as we read all of the different kind of sub-narrative arcs throughout this book that, again, are leading up to these 6 events, we kind of have to keep in mind of everything that's happened before this. And I mean everything, like going back to Genesis 1, okay? Because once we get into Kings, if we're far enough into the Bible from Genesis to Revelation that if we lose track of where we came from in those early books, we aren't going to be able to make as much sense of what's going on in Kings. So having kind of a familiar snapshot of everything that's happened up until this point is really helpful. So everything that's happened from Genesis 1 kind of up until Kings. God created, humanity fell, and then God implemented his plan of redemption. And within that plan of redemption, now we have all these subpoints, right? We have Noah and the flood event. We have Abraham and the covenant and his son Isaac and his sons Jacob and Esau. And then we have the Exodus event in the book of Exodus. And then after the Exodus event, we have the covenant between God and the descendants of Abraham at Mount Sinai, where Israel agrees to be God's kingdom of priests and his royal nation, his holy nation, holy nation, kingdom of priests and holy nation. And we see that taking place in Exodus 19, verses 3 through 8. Then we have Israel receiving the law, so that's Exodus 20 through Leviticus, and then parts of Numbers and Deuteronomy. And then we have the 40 years of unfaithfulness in the wilderness. Then we have that second Exodus generation finally inheriting the land in Joshua. And then we have cyclical disobedience throughout the time of the judges. And then we get into the books of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel. And in 1 Samuel 8, Israel demands a king because they want to be like all the other nations that are around them. So we have a king that gets crowned, and that is Saul in 1 Kings 8. And then after Saul's death, we have the rise of David, and he becomes king, and he is king over a united Israel. And then we pick up in 1 Kings 1, we can see here on the screen, David's last days. So 1 Kings begins at the end of David's reign as king. And so that's why the first significant event out of our 6 is the transition of power from David to Solomon. And it doesn't take us very far into 1 Kings to realize there's drama, there's tension, there's that's going on. And so we read this first paragraph, and not the first paragraph, the second paragraph, verses 5 through 8 in 1 Kings 1, and we already start to see kind of this tension that's developing and is going to take place early on. So Solomon is David's son, and he's been the one who David has named as his successor. But another one of David's sons, Adonijah, is like, I think I want to be king. And he starts making plans to become king. David doesn't rebuke him. David doesn't shut it down. And now all of a sudden you have like Adonijah kind of becoming king. And then David's like, no, Solomon's going to be king. So you have this tension between these two brothers. And that kind of sets the book up for all of the tension that we're going to see throughout the rest of it. So these two books, 1st and 2nd Kings, very much are tension, drama, action-packed, very fast-paced. We cover hundreds of years of history within these two books. And it's easy to just kind of like, oh, feel like you're on a roller coaster and also getting sprayed in the face from a fire hose, right? So it's just kind of all of that happening at once. So that snapshot of basically the biblical history is really valuable when we read 1st and 2nd Kings, because as the narrative, the overarching narrative and the undergirding sub-narratives, as those progress throughout the book, the human writers of 1st and 2nd Kings kind of expect two things from the readers. First, they expect that the reader shares kind of a common understanding of Israel's history and this biblical narrative. So as we read through Kings, not everything that these kings did is mentioned. As we get into the cycle of Kings, let me get down and find an example here. Jeroboam, prophecy. Okay, so, okay, so, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it off the top of my head. But ultimately, when we get to the end of kind of each king's tenure in these books, we see kind of like, well, and they did many other things, and those are written down in the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel or in the Chronicles of Kings of Judah. That, the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel or the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, that is not the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles that we have in the Bible. Those are different, right? So we don't actually have those chronicles that are talked about in 1st and 2nd Kings, but we can see that there's a greater collection of events and details to these kings' reigns, and the writer of 1st and 2nd Kings only took a selection of that. And they said, hey, I'm going to include these events. I'm not going to include all those other events. And the events that are included are intentional. There's a purpose behind it, right? Because he's pushing us towards a conclusion of this narrative. But that writer kind of assumes and expects that the readers will have a common understanding of this history. The second thing that the writer understands or expects the reader to understand is why the events of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, happened, particularly why the exile events happened. And we're supposed to kind of intuitively understand that as we read the information that the writer provides. So a great example of this is we see kind of at the end of most of the kings, it'll be like, and the king didn't tear down the high places. And you're like, well, what's going on? So the high places were kind of spots throughout the kingdoms, usually like on a high hill under a tree, where the people of Israel would go and bring their sacrifices, and they would sacrifice on the high places. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's really convenient. That's great. Well, except for God had specifically instructed them not to do that. They were supposed to bring their sacrifices to the tent of meeting, to where the tabernacle is, or to where the Levites were, and then once the temple was built, to the temple. So they were supposed to bring their sacrifices like to the presence of the Lord, not to the high places. So every time we see that the high places weren't torn down and that Israel or Judah is using them, you're like, great, another sign of disobedience. And again, kind of the writer expects the reader to notice that and to be able to kind of put two and two together of like, they're supposed to be doing this based on the covenant obligations that they agreed to in Exodus 19. But they're doing this. And so the Lord said in Leviticus 27 and Deuteronomy 26, hey, if you're faithful to the covenant, then there are the blessings. You're going to experience the blessing of being in covenant with me. If you're unfaithful to the covenant that you agreed to, then you're going to experience the curses, and it's going to be really bad. So we're supposed to have kind of that undergirding knowledge. And there, if we have that, as we read through Kings, a lot of this information starts to make a lot more sense, and it becomes very valuable. And we're like, oh gosh, this is building a lot of drama. This is building a lot of tension, a lot of anticipation. We're building towards a narrative climax. And that narrative climax comes in 2 Kings 17 and 2 Kings 25. So we finally hit that point in chapter 17 of 2 Kings. And so it's like, oh gosh. So yeah, we see here why Israel fell. And now we go through this whole long chapter of explaining why they fell. So that's really what we're building to, okay? That's why this book, the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, can feel so disjointed because we have a lot of things happening, a lot of history, and the ancient world chronicled history differently than we do today. They didn't use our modern dating system. So we say that King David lived around 1000 BC. Well, David didn't know that. He didn't know that he was in 1000 BC, right? When we say that Israel went into exile in 722 BC, Israel didn't know that was 722 BC. And so the way that they chronicled history was from different points of reference. That you'll notice, it'll say, in the 10th year of King so-and-so, this other king came to power in this kingdom. And so it goes back and forth. So after 1 Kings 12, when you see the king of Israel and the king of Judah, those are two separate kings ruling two different kingdoms. And so when it says, in the X year of the king of Israel, so-and-so came to power in the kingdom of Judah, those are two different kings in two different kingdoms. And so their points of reference are actually, hey, we gauge time kind of by this king over here in this kingdom. And so that's why it's so confusing for us. So a big part of being able to trace God's redemptive plan and the meta-narrative of Scripture and be able to make those kinds of observations about who God is, what he has done, what he is doing, what he's promised to do, and how all those things line up, that can be really tough to trace in the book of Kings until we kind of understand what it is that we're dealing with and how the ancients recorded history. So that's kind of some of the things that I've experienced when I first read Kings. I was like, I'm totally lost. And then as I studied the books more, I realized, wait, okay, this is what we're dealing with. It gives me this information, and I can see how this information leads to this conclusion, and kind of all of the information is building up to these 6 main events. And in those 6 main events, the 2 really main events are the exiles of Israel and Judah. Oh, okay, this is starting to make sense. And then we can see how everything has built up to Kings, and then also how the rest of the narrative flows out of Kings. So that's kind of how these books function and how they present the information. So now let's talk a little bit about what are some of the conclusions that we can take away, particularly when we look at this 50,000 foot view, this meta-narrative view of Kings. How does the book of Kings propel the meta-narrative forward, and how does it kind of tell us about who God is, what he has done, what he's doing, and what he will do? So first of all, Israel has completely failed at being God's kingdom of priests and holy nation. Remember, I keep coming back to this in this Bible in a Year, tracing the meta-narrative. Exodus 19, verses 3 through 8. 3 through 6 is where kind of God is casting the vision of the covenant. And then verses 7 or 8 are when the elders of Israel agree to the covenant. Like, everything else flows out of that. And we have to evaluate Israel as a nation against the covenant obligations that they've agreed to uphold as being in covenant with Yahweh. So the Mosaic Law flows out of Exodus 19, 3 through 8, right? In fact, the Ten Commandments begin the giving of the law, and those are in Exodus 20, right after Exodus 19. Everything flows out of this. So when we look at Israel as a nation after they've inherited the land, we want to evaluate what they've done versus what they've agreed to do. And the first thing we can conclude as we read through the book of Kings is they've completely failed at living up to what they've agreed to do. Israel's rejection of God and demand for a king to be like all the other nations has resulted in them being conquered like all the other nations. So Israel conquered the land through being obedient to the Lord, and the Lord won the victory in the book of Joshua. But since that first generation entered the land, it's rampant disobedience, and we see that very obviously in Kings. And so, unfortunately, there are high hopes, but Israel has totally failed. The second thing that we can take away from the book of Kings, from a meta-narrative 50,000-foot vantage point, is that God is faithful to his covenant. Right? I think I touched on this a few minutes earlier, but God laid out in Leviticus, or I think I might have gotten these chapters flip-flopped last time. It's Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 27 through 28. He's laid out the blessings and the curses that are going to follow if Israel is faithful or unfaithful to the covenant. And so when we look at what these blessings will be or what the curses will be, depending on Israel's faithfulness or unfaithfulness, we see that God upheld his end of the covenant. When he says, hey, if you're unfaithful, this is what I'm going to do, he does that. And so they are driven out. Their territory is shrinking down. All of these things happen. So God is faithful to his covenant that he's laid out in the law. The third thing that we can take away from a high 50,000 meter or a 50,000 foot meta-narrative vantage point is that a better king is needed. Israel, God's people, needs a better king. Okay, so the descendants of Abraham, they need a better king. Even when we look at David, right? Most of David's story is captured in 1 Samuel 15 through the end of 2 Samuel. When we look at the story of David, he's Israel's best king. He's the king that all the other kings in the book of Kings are evaluated against. And they'll say, King so-and-so rose to power, but he wasn't like his father David. He did evil before the Lord. Or he followed the footsteps of his father David, right? So David is the archetype king that all the rest of Israel and Judah's kings are evaluated against. But even David is not a good enough king to keep Israel faithful to the covenant obligations that they agreed to. So even the best of kings in Israel and Judah could not lead their nation in upholding God's covenant of faith and ensuing obligations. And so we end the book of Kings knowing that a better king is needed. A more faithful king is needed. And so there's just that tiny little seed that's planted of something more needs to happen. And obviously from our vantage point with the New Testament and the coming of the Messiah and everything that entails, we're able to see how Jesus fulfills the role of king and is faithful to these obligations. So the three things that we can take away from Kings is Israel's completely failed, God is faithful to his covenant, and a better king is needed. And all of this information that is presented in Kings kind of leads us towards those conclusions by highlighting these 6 main events. And again, those 6 main events are the transition of power from David to Solomon in 1 Kings 1 through 2, the construction of the temple. Solomon builds the temple and dedicates it in 1 Kings 5 through 6, and then chapter 8. Then the splitting of the kingdom in 1 Kings 12. Then the ministries of the prophets, that's a very big part of, the ministries of the prophets, very big chunk of these two books. 1 Kings 13, kind of through 2 Kings 13. Then the exile of the nation of Israel, which is the northern nation, the northern 10 tribes of the 12 tribes that originally inherited the land, in 2 Kings 17. And then the sixth event is the exile of Judah, which takes place in 2 Kings 25. And so Judah, again, is the southern nation, the southern two tribes. They go into exile to the Babylonians, and that is the sixth main event. So I hope that is a helpful overview of Kings. It's kind of a tricky book. You either kind of do a video where you're doing a study through Kings, or you're actually not in the text that much, and you're kind of just casting the vision of how these two books function in the Bible. And so hopefully that makes more sense. If you stay tuned here for a quick minute, I'm going to pull up some maps and just kind of show you what the territory looked like when Israel inherited the land, what it looked like under Saul's kingship, David, Solomon, and then the split kingdoms. So let's do that really quickly because I want to, okay. So, that's not what I want. I want tribes of Israel. Okay. So in the book of Joshua and through Judges, right? But mostly Joshua when Israel inherits the land. This is what the map looks like. I can probably go one more. So we have the 12 tribes. This is where these are the allotments of land, right? So this is what the territory looked like. Now I've got to pull up. So this is a second map that shows you the kingdoms of Saul, David, and Solomon. The purple is the kingdom of Saul, right? So we can see from here the territory that they had when Saul was king, like it was vastly, vastly reduced under Saul. So the purple represents Saul's kingdom. The green represents David's kingdom. And we can see, I mean, that's closer, but even still, it's pretty close, but we've lost this coastland here, right? We've lost this coastland. Well, actually, technically, they went up 2 Tyre, so we haven't lost that. That's my mistake. David actually expands further to the north, and so the original 12 tribes work up to Tyre, so he didn't actually lose this. That's my bad. Sometimes I forget that David extended further north. So yeah, we have a pretty coherent overlap, and then also some extension into the north. And then we get into Solomon's territory, which goes up to this yellow part, and he actually goes all the way up to the Euphrates River. So Solomon controls a very vast kingdom, and it's kind of the only time in Israel's history that it can be considered an empire. Then, after the splitting of the kingdom, now we come back here. So this pink here that says Israel, that's the northern kingdom of Israel. This blue here that says Judah, that's the southern kingdom of Judah. So after 1 Kings 12, when the kingdom splits and you see so-and-so was king in Israel, that's referring to this kingdom here in this pink purple. Then when you see so-and-so is king of Judah, that's down here in the blue. Eventually, this northern kingdom, they get exiled to the Assyrian Empire in 722. Then the southern kingdom, they get exiled to Babylon in 605 through 586. So yeah, understanding kind of everything that's led up to Kings, the actual information that Kings gives you, and the perspective of the writer and why the writer included that information, and kind of everything that information leads to, that really helps in your understanding of Kings. And then also kind of understanding the map and the layout is really helpful, because otherwise these two books are just kind of like, I'm totally lost. So if we can think of the function of kings within the biblical narrative, that really helps us better understand how these two books contribute to that narrative, how they contribute to God's redemptive plan, and how they also propel the narrative of God's redemptive plan forward, so we can get a better understanding of who God is by understanding what has he done, what is he doing, what will he do. So hopefully that makes these two books make a little bit more sense, and then we're going to actually cover kind of the same type of stuff in the books of Chronicles, because Chronicles kind of tells a similar story, just from a different vantage point. So I hope to see you in the videos that are going to go over Chronicles, and until then, happy Bibling.